Milltown was once a thriving industrial town in northwestern Washington state, where the Milltown timber sawmill provided jobs for nearly half of the local population. But 10 years ago, the company closed, and the town began to slowly decline. Now, the main street is lined with boarded-up storefronts, and meth labs and overdoses are on the rise in the outskirts. "I remember Milltown very differently," says Sheriff Greg Donovan, looking at an old photo of the town square in his office. "Kids used to play here until dark. No one locked their doors. Now everything has changed." In these difficult circumstances, Ryan Pierce seemed like an anomaly, a man who had managed not only to survive, but to thrive. At 34, he was the head of Pierce Construction, a building company founded by his father. When other businesses were closing one after another, Ryan found ways to adapt, taking on contracts in neighboring towns, cutting margins to a minimum just to keep his workers. He wasn't rich by Seattle standards, but in Little Milltown, his 2-story house on a hill and his new Ford F-150 pickup truck were symbols of success. "Ryan was always special," recalls Martha Clark, his high school teacher. "Not the brightest student, but hardworking and decent. When his father died of cancer 5 years ago, many thought the company wouldn't last a year, but Ryan pulled through." In a town where good news was becoming scarce, Ryan was respected. He sponsored the local high school football team, regularly donated food to the city food bank, and gave toys to children from low-income families every Christmas. He was generous, maybe too generous, says Scott Mallory, adjusting his baseball cap with hands stained from machine oil. At 32, Scott owned the only auto repair shop in Milltown and had been friends with Ryan since first grade. "Sometimes I told him that people would take advantage of him. But Ryan, he believed in the good in people. It was this belief and trust, according to those close to him, that made Ryan vulnerable to what happened next." Melissa Hayes arrived in Milltown on a February evening in 2023, when winter was already beginning to recede. She got a job as a waitress at Joe's, the only decent restaurant in town, located not far from Ryan's office. "She stood out right away," said Pam Riley, the restaurant manager. "She wasn't a stunning beauty, but there was something magnetic about her. She could win people over in a matter of minutes." A petite brunette with lively green eyes, Melissa said she had moved from Portland to start over after a painful breakup. She rented a small apartment above an old laundromat and seemed grateful for the opportunity to work in the unpretentious town. She said she was tired of the city noise and fake relationships, Pam recalls. "And you know, we believed her. We all believed her." Ryan first met Melissa on March 14th when he stopped by Joe's for lunch with his contractor. According to witnesses, there was an instant spark between them. "I remember that day," says Joe Carpenter, the restaurant's owner. "Ryan ordered the house special steak and she brought him chicken soup. She said he looked like he had a cold. And you know what? He had been coughing all week. It was a small thing, but you could tell it touched him." Instead of pointing out the mistake, Ryan ate the soup, left a generous tip, and returned alone the next day. A week later, they were having dinner together after her shift. "It was like something out of a movie," Scott recalls, lighting his 3rd cigarette of the interview. "Suddenly, my best friend, who hadn't shown any interest in dating for years after his college girlfriend dumped him, was walking around like he was in a daze and talking about nothing but Melissa." In a small town, news travels fast. Soon everyone knew that the owner of Pierce Construction was dating the new waitress. Most people were happy for Ryan, a good-natured bachelor who, by all accounts, deserved happiness. "They seemed like the perfect couple," says Martha Clark. "She was always so attentive to him in public. She would touch his hand, laugh at his jokes, and Ryan, he literally glowed when he was around her." However, not everyone was thrilled about the rapidly developing relationship. "Something about her made me wary," Scott admits. "Maybe it was how quickly she learned everything about his business, or how skillfully she avoided talking about her past. Or maybe I was just jealous. It was the first time in a long time that Ryan had spent a weekend away from me." A month after they met, Ryan invited Melissa to Seattle for the weekend. A fancy hotel, dinner at a restaurant with a view of the Space Needle, tickets to a Broadway musical touring the city. "He called me from a jewelry store," Scott recalls. "He asked if it was too early to give Melissa emerald earrings. I said maybe he should wait. He bought them anyway." By the beginning of summer, Melissa had become Ryan's constant companion at all city events. She quickly won over his circle, especially his elderly clients, whom she helped with small errands such as grocery shopping and picking up prescriptions. She knew how to make an impression, said Detective Ellen Brody, who later worked on the case. She created the image of the perfect, caring girlfriend. Behind the scenes, she methodically distanced Ryan from anyone who might notice the inconsistencies. By the end of June, Scott was surprised to find that Ryan had canceled their traditional fishing trip because Melissa had planned a romantic weekend getaway. Then he skipped his weekly poker game with his coworkers. And in July, for the first time in 5 years, he didn't show up for the Mallory family's annual barbecue. I tried to talk to him, Scott sighs. I told him his friends missed him. He dismissed me, saying, "You just don't understand what real love is." By August, Ryan had reduced his contact with his old friends to a minimum. His world had shrunk to work and Melissa. A classic isolation strategy, comments Dr. Linda Harris, a psychologist specializing in manipulative relationships. Gradually cut the victim off from their support system so that they become completely dependent on the manipulator. On the last day of summer, as the sun painted the sky over Milltown orange, Ryan met Scott at the Lumberjack Bar for the first time in weeks. He looked happy, but somehow lost, Scott recalls. He showed me pictures of Melissa on his phone and said he had never felt more alive. Then he took out a small velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring, not huge but valued by jewelers at around $12,000, a significant amount for the owner of a small construction company in a dying town. I asked if he was rushing things. We'd only known Melissa for 6 months, Scott says, his voice trembling with emotion. He got angry. He said I was jealous of his happiness, that if I was a real friend, I should support him. That night, they had their first fight in 25 years of friendship. Ryan left, leaving behind an unfinished beer and a hurt friend. If I could go back to that night, Scott says quietly, staring into space, I would grab him by the shoulders and yell until he heard me. Maybe then things would have turned out differently. But it was too late. Ryan Pierce had fallen under the spell of a woman who, less than a year later, would shoot him in the head. Autumn in Milltown was rainy, even by Washington state standards. The gray sky seemed to hang over the city like a heavy blanket, and endless downpours turned the streets into gloomy corridors between dilapidated buildings. Rain drummed on the roof of Ryan Pierce's house on that Saturday, October 1st, as a moving van pulled up to the driveway. Melissa Hayes was officially moving in with her boyfriend, just 6.5 months after they met. It was strange, recalls Terry Landers, Ryan's neighbor. She had almost no belongings. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of books, some odds and ends. It was as if she didn't plan on staying anywhere for very long. Ryan didn't make an official proposal, but he kept a ring in his safe, waiting for the perfect moment, as he confessed to his accountant, Vernon Meyer. The guy was head over heels in love, Vernon says. For the first time in years, he asked me to draw up a new financial plan that included his future wife. The first few weeks of living together seemed cloudless. Melissa continued to work at Joe's, although she cut her hours to 3 days a week. She took on household duties, cooked dinners that Ryan raved about on social media, and even started planting a small garden in the backyard. They were the perfect couple, comments Pam Riley. When they walked into a restaurant on Sundays, everyone envied their relationship. He looked at her like she was the 8th wonder of the world. However, it was during this period, according to later testimony, that Melissa began to show an unusual interest in Ryan's financial affairs. At first, they were innocent questions, says Vernon Meyer, nervously adjusting his glasses. How his business was structured, how stable his income was, whether the company had any debts. She explained that she wanted to understand Ryan's life better. At the end of October, Melissa offered to help with the company's accounting to save money. Ryan politely declined, explaining that he trusted professionals to do the job. According to Vernon, this was one of the rare occasions when Ryan did not give in to his girlfriend's wishes. Scott Mallory, with whom Ryan had reconciled after their September quarrel, noticed changes in his friend's behavior. He was constantly checking his phone, even during our rare meetings. He was afraid of missing a message from her. If she called, he would jump up, no matter what we were doing. In early November, an incident occurred that Detective Brody would later call the first serious red flag. During a rare poker night in Scott's garage, he decided to voice his concerns. I said straight out, "Ryan, I think she's with you for the money," Scott recalls, clenching his fists. I reminded him how she was always interested in his business, how she asked me about his finances, how she managed their joint expenses. According to other participants in the game, Ryan flew into a rage. I'd never seen him like that, admits Don Higgins, an employee at Pierce Construction. He threw down his cards, called Scott a jealous loser, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it almost came off its hinges. After that incident, Ryan and Scott didn't speak to each other for 3 weeks, a record length of time in their friendship. Melissa, according to those around her, began to actively strengthen her position in Ryan's life. She completely revamped his wardrobe, says Marjorie Simmons, owner of the only clothing boutique in Milltown. She made him throw out his old jeans and shirts and bought him cashmere sweaters and designer suits. At the opening of the new city library, they looked like a couple out of a magazine. Him in a $2,000 suit, her in an elegant dress. By early December, Melissa had become Ryan's unofficial social life manager. She accepted and declined invitations, planned weekends, and decided who they would socialize with. It was then, according to bank records, that Ryan added her to his main account as an authorized user. It was a vote of absolute confidence, comments financial advisor Danielle Warren. He gave her access to an account that held almost all of his personal savings, about $180,000. It is noteworthy that during this same period, Pierce Construction won a major bid to renovate a municipal building in a neighboring county, a $1.2 million contract, the largest in the firm's history. Ryan was on cloud nine, recalls Don Higgins. It meant stability for the company for at least the next year and a half. He was talking about expansion, about hiring new people. In the run-up to Christmas, Ryan seemed to be at the peak of his life, a successful business, a promising future, and the woman he loved. On December 23rd, during dinner at Joe's restaurant, decorated with holiday garlands, he finally proposed to Melissa. It was very touching, says Joe Carpenter. He got down on one knee right in the middle of the room and gave a beautiful speech about how she had changed his life. Everyone applauded when she said yes. 3 days after the engagement, according to documents later discovered by Detective Brody, Ryan changed his will, naming Melissa as his primary heir instead of his younger sister, who lived in Oregon. His lawyer tried to suggest at least a prenuptial agreement, Brody notes. Ryan refused. He said it would insult his future wife. The first cracks in the perfect facade began to appear in mid-January. Sylvia Pierce, Ryan's mother, arrived from Florida for a 2-week visit to meet her future daughter-in-law. They didn't get along, recalls Terry Landers. One day I went to borrow some sugar and heard them arguing in the kitchen. Melissa was saying something about how the older generation doesn't understand modern relationships, and Mrs. Pierce insisted that Ryan was rushing things. After Ryan's mother left, neighbors noticed the first serious argument between the couple. They were yelling so loud I could hear them through the closed windows, admits Ray Dawson, a neighbor across the street. She was yelling that he wasn't protecting her from his family, and he was defending himself. It went on for 2 hours. Nevertheless, they continued to appear to have a perfect relationship in public. In early February, Melissa organized a surprise birthday trip to Las Vegas for Ryan. Photos of the happy couple at the Bellagio fountains flooded social media. They looked absolutely happy, says Pam Riley. But when I asked Melissa about the trip, she was strangely evasive. She just said that investing in a relationship always pays off. The wording struck me as odd. At the end of February, something happened that would later take on a sinister meaning. Melissa unexpectedly asked Ryan to make a complete inventory of his possessions for insurance purposes. They spent the weekend photographing and recording everything from expensive watches to tools in the garage. Essentially, she created a catalog of everything that could be converted into cash, Detective Brody comments, a typical step in preparation for certain actions. In early March, almost a year after they met, Scott Mallory made one last attempt to open his friend's eyes to the true nature of his relationship. He went to the Pierce construction office with printed messages from a local community forum where an anonymous woman, whom Scott identified as Melissa, asked about inheritance laws in Washington state and the rights of common law wives. "I thought that would be the last straw," Scott sighs. I showed him the messages and described the strange behavior that mutual acquaintances had told me about. Ryan's reaction shocked everyone in the office. "He lost his temper," says Lori Jenkins, the company's secretary. "He yelled that Scott was obsessed with their relationship, that he just couldn't accept his happiness. Then he ordered the security guard to remove Scott and never let him back in the building." Their friendship officially ended that day. "The last thing I said to him was, 'She's using you, and one day you'll regret not listening to me,'" Scott says, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Every day I regret being right." Meanwhile, others began to notice Melissa's strange behavior. Pam Riley overheard her talking on the phone in the restaurant parking lot. She was talking to someone very intimately, Pam recalls. She said, "It'll be ready soon, just be patient." When I asked who she was talking to, Melissa said it was her sister in Portland. But the tone, it definitely wasn't a family conversation. In mid-March, Ryan unexpectedly showed up at the bank with a strange request to cash out nearly $25,000 from his account. "It was unusual," says Monica Chan, the bank manager. "He always preferred electronic payments. When I asked him why he wanted cash, he said he wanted to surprise Melissa for their anniversary." 2 days later, Ryan accidentally saw a strange email in the shared email account he had set up with Melissa. A travel agency was confirming a flight reservation for Melissa Hayes, just one ticket, to Cancun, Mexico, with an open return date. "He was puzzled," says Don Higgins, who was having lunch with his boss that day. "He asked me if Melissa had said anything about a trip to Mexico. My advice was straightforward: ask her yourself." That evening, Ryan did indeed ask his fiancée about the mysterious ticket. Melissa's explanation, which he later relayed to Don, was entirely plausible. She was planning a surprise trip for the two of them for their honeymoon, but wanted to check the dates with his work schedule first. He believed her, Don says, but something about the story bothered him. The next day, he was distracted, constantly checking his phone. On March 23rd, exactly 1 year after they first met, Ryan found a driver's license in Melissa's purse with the name Amanda Reese, with Melissa's photo, but with a different name and date of birth. Instead of confronting her immediately, he decided to conduct his own investigation. It was the first truly intelligent thing Ryan had done in a year, Detective Brody commented. Unfortunately, it was too late. The last week of March 2024 was unusually sunny in Milltown, but for Ryan Pierce, those days were filled with doubt. The fake ID found in Melissa's bag opened a door he had long refused to notice. "He looked like a man slowly waking up from a deep sleep," recalls Lori Jenkins, secretary at Pierce Construction. "He came to the office earlier and left later. He spent a lot of time at his computer with the door closed." Not trusting anyone with his suspicions, Ryan began his own investigation. Using a copy of Amanda Reese's driver's license, he hired a private investigator from Seattle. He paid in cash, leaving no digital trail. "He called me on March 28th, says Michael Cunningham, a former police officer and now a private investigator. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension. He just said, 'I need to know everything about this woman, and no one can know I asked.'" That same day, to avoid arousing suspicion, Ryan bought Melissa a diamond bracelet to mark the anniversary of their meeting. $5,000, notes Detective Brody. Paradoxically, he already suspected her of cheating, but continued to spend money as if trying to buy off his doubts. Publicly, nothing changed. Ryan and Melissa continued to play the role of the perfect couple. They attended the mayor's wedding together, smiled for photos in the local newspaper, and discussed plans for their own wedding, scheduled for September. "He was an amazing actor," says Don Higgins. "We worked side by side every day, and I didn't notice anything unusual. Maybe he was a little more pensive, but who isn't before a wedding?" On April 1st, Michael Cunningham sent Ryan a preliminary report. Melissa Hayes, it turned out, did not exist until 2021. The identity was created using the birth certificate of a deceased child, a tactic familiar to law enforcement. The woman's real name was likely Amanda Reese, 32, not 29 as she claimed, a native of San Diego. This is a classic scheme for creating a new identity, explains identity crime expert Rachel Morgan. They find records of a baby who died around the same time the fraudster was born. They obtain a birth certificate and then use it to create the rest of the documents. But the most disturbing discovery concerned Amanda Reese's past. In 2019 to 2020, she was in a relationship with Gerald Foster, a 58-year-old car dealership owner in Southern California. Foster died of a suspected heart attack at his home in San Diego. Amanda, his girlfriend at the time, inherited a significant portion of his estate under a recently amended will. The San Diego Police Department conducted an investigation, Cunningham's report said. Suspicion of poisoning, but not enough evidence to press charges. Foster's son from his first marriage filed a civil suit to have the will invalidated, and the case was settled out of court. 3 days after receiving the report, Ryan confronted Melissa in the kitchen of their home. The night before, he had noticed her looking for something in his office while he thought he was asleep. "I need to ask you something," Ryan began, according to his subsequent testimony. "Who is Amanda Reese?" According to Ryan, Melissa's face froze for a moment, then she burst into tears. The story she told was a masterfully crafted mix of truth and lies. She admitted that she had used a fake identity, Ryan later told Detective Brody, but she explained that it was an attempt to escape from a violent ex-boyfriend who was stalking her. She said that her real name was indeed Amanda, but that she had taken the surname Hayes and changed her date of birth for safety reasons. As for Gerald Foster, Melissa presented him as a father figure who had helped her through difficult times. She denied any romantic relationship with him and called the poisoning allegations vicious slander by a son who simply wanted all the inheritance for himself. She cried and begged for forgiveness for lying, Ryan continued. She said she was afraid of losing me if she told me the truth about her past, that she loved me more than anything and couldn't imagine life without me. Melissa's story was difficult to verify immediately, and she appealed to the very traits that made Ryan vulnerable: his desire to protect, his faith in people, his tendency to give second chances. Classic manipulation through pity, comments Dr. Linda Harris, turning the exposure of a lie into an opportunity to portray oneself as the victim of even more serious circumstances. This turns the accuser into a potential savior. Although Ryan outwardly accepted Melissa's explanation, inwardly his doubts only grew. The next day he called Michael Cunningham and asked him to dig deeper, especially into the Foster case. He sounded wary, Cunningham recalls. He said, "Something doesn't add up here, check all your sources." Over the next week, Ryan led a double life, continuing to play the role of the loving fiancé while secretly preparing for a possible breakup. He met with his lawyer to discuss reversing the recent changes to his will and secretly opened a new bank account that Melissa didn't know about. On April 13th, Cunningham sent a second report, and its contents left no room for doubt. Medical records obtained from an informant at the San Diego coroner's office showed abnormally high levels of digitalis in Gerald Foster's blood, a drug that in high doses can cause symptoms similar to a heart attack. Foster's son was right, the report said. All signs point to intentional poisoning. But because the body was cremated immediately after the preliminary autopsy, a full investigation is impossible. Furthermore, Cunningham discovered evidence of another suspicious relationship in Melissa's past. In 2017 to 2018, she was engaged to Richard Colefield, a 61-year-old widower from Phoenix who died of complications from diabetes shortly before their wedding. Amanda did not inherit his fortune, as the will had not been changed, but she did receive an expensive car and jewelry as gifts. Two elderly wealthy men, both deaths from natural causes that are easy to fake, Cunningham wrote. Too much of a coincidence. That evening, Ryan sat in his office for a long time, rereading the report. According to Terry Landers, the light in his window was on until 3 in the morning. The next morning, Saturday, Ryan told Melissa he was going to check out a new construction site. Instead, he went to the only person he could still trust, Scott Mallory. He looked terrible, Scott recalls. He was thin, with dark circles under his eyes. He just stood in the doorway of my house and said, "You were right. She's not who she says she is." For 3 hours in Scott's garage, Ryan laid out everything he had learned and showed him Cunningham's reports. They came up with a plan. Ryan would go home, act normal, but on Monday, he would meet with a lawyer to revoke the changes to the will and with his banker to close their joint accounts. On Tuesday, he planned to tell Melissa that he knew the truth and demand that she leave the house. He was determined, Scott says. He finally saw her for who she really was. He said to me, "How could I have been so blind?" But Ryan didn't count on how observant Melissa was. When he returned home, she noticed the changes in his behavior. His explanation about problems at the construction site sounded unconvincing. Most importantly, she noticed gravel on his shoes, which was characteristic of Scott Mallory's driveway. She knew his daily routine better than he did, notes Detective Brody. Controllers always noticed the slightest deviations from the established order. Sunday passed in a tense but outwardly calm atmosphere. They cooked dinner together, watched a movie, and discussed plans for the coming week. But when Ryan took a shower before bed, Melissa checked his phone and found messages from Cunningham and recent calls to Scott. Her plan was falling apart before her eyes, says Dr. Harris. For people like this, losing control is unbearable. It triggers primitive self-preservation responses. On Monday morning, April 17th, Ryan left for the office earlier than usual. At 9:30 a.m., he called his lawyer and scheduled an appointment for 2 p.m. He then contacted his banker for a meeting at 4 p.m. During his lunch break, he called Scott to let him know his plans. He sounded almost relieved, Scott recalls. He said that by tomorrow evening, it would all be over. That after Melissa left, he wanted to have a barbecue in my backyard, like old times. It was Ryan's last normal conversation before the tragedy. At the same time Ryan was planning his escape, Melissa was acting with frightening efficiency. At 10:40 a.m., she visited a hardware store in a neighboring town, where she purchased a powerful cleaning agent, rubber gloves, and a large plastic tarp. She then stopped by Joe's, where she informed Pam Riley that she was taking the next day off due to a migraine. After that, according to her cell phone GPS, Melissa drove to Tacoma, a city an hour away from Milltown. There, at a sporting goods store, she purchased hunting gloves and red paintball capsules. And at a second-hand store on the outskirts of town, she bought a used Glock 19 and a box of ammunition. The salesman, Frank Morton, later confirmed that he did not ask her for identification because she looked like a decent woman. She methodically gathered everything she needed for the murder, Detective Brody commented. Gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, capsules with paint to simulate blood spatter during the robbery, cleaning supplies to destroy evidence, a tarp to transport the body. That evening, Melissa prepared Ryan's favorite meal, steak with mashed potatoes and asparagus. She opened a bottle of expensive wine. When he returned home, she greeted him in a new, form-fitting dress she had bought especially for the occasion. The Last Supper, Prosecutor David Church notes grimly. She didn't even try to poison him like her previous victims. This time, she chose a more direct approach. During dinner, Melissa was unusually attentive and loving. According to Ryan's subsequent testimony, she spoke several times about her love for him, about how happy she was to have found the one. She suggested postponing the wedding for a month so that everything would be perfect, and she kept pouring him wine. She lulled him into a false sense of security, says Dr. Harris. It's a classic manipulative technique, creating a sense of security right before the attack. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where they continued drinking wine. Melissa suggested playing cards, their usual evening entertainment. During the game, she discreetly added a powerful sleeping pill to Ryan's glass. I started to feel very sleepy, Ryan later recalled. I decided it was because of the wine and the long day at work. I remember her suggesting I lie down on the sofa and saying she would bring me a blanket. The last thing Ryan remembered before losing consciousness was Melissa gently adjusting the pillow under his head and whispering, "Sleep well, my love." The rest of the events had to be reconstructed by investigators based on clues and subsequent confessions. When Ryan was fast asleep, Melissa began preparing to stage a robbery. She scattered things around the office, took several valuable items, and placed them by the front door to make it look like a burglary in progress. Then she took out the gun, put on gloves, and returned to the sleeping Ryan. At 11:17 p.m., a neighbor, Terry Landers, heard a sound like a pop. "I didn't immediately realize it was a gunshot," she recalls. "I thought someone's car had stalled, but then I felt uneasy and looked out the window. The lights were on in Ryan's house, but there was no movement." Terry rang her neighbor's doorbell, but no one answered. Concerned, she returned home and decided to call in the morning if she didn't see any signs of activity. Inside the house, Melissa was confronted with the consequences of her actions. She had shot Ryan in the head at close range, aiming for his temple. The bullet entered at an angle, passed through the frontal lobe of the brain, and lodged in the skull on the opposite side. Blood covered the sofa and carpet. "She assumed that death would be instantaneous," explains Dr. James Hansen, the neurosurgeon who later operated on Ryan. "But the bullet's trajectory was such that it did not hit any critical areas of the brain. It was incredibly lucky, if you can call it that, in such a situation." Believing Ryan to be dead, Melissa moved on to the next stage of her plan. She broke down the back door to make it look like someone had broken in, splashed the contents of the red paint capsules around to create the impression of a struggle, and scattered valuable items as if the intruder had been looking for something specific. She then removed her gloves, hid the gun in a specially prepared hiding place in the garden, changed her clothes, and called her friend Jenny Lewis, who lived an hour away. She said she had had a fight with Ryan and wanted to spend the night at her place. The call was recorded at 11:42 p.m., creating an alibi, Detective Brody stated. "A classic move, ensuring you have witnesses to prove you weren't at the scene of the crime." Melissa left Ryan's house at 11:51 p.m., leaving him bleeding to death on the couch. She figured that even if his body was found the next day, all the evidence would point to a robbery gone wrong. By then, she'd be long gone, with a new identity and access to his bank accounts and insurance. But fate had other plans. At 6:15 a.m., Terry Landers, concerned by the silence in her usually active neighborhood, decided to check if everything was okay. Noticing the broken back door, she immediately called the police. Patrol Officer Jim Becker arrived on the scene at 6:31 a.m. and found Ryan still alive, but in critical condition. "We didn't think he would survive until the ambulance arrived," Officer Becker recalls, "but this guy was incredibly resilient." At 7:05 a.m., paramedics transported Ryan to the county hospital, where Dr. Hansen immediately began surgery to remove the bullet and reduce intracranial pressure. The operation lasted nearly 8 hours. At 8:15 a.m., Detective Ellen Brody arrived at Ryan's home, where a crime scene team was already at work. Initial impressions pointed to a violent robbery, but Brody's experienced eye immediately noticed discrepancies. "Too neat a mess," she said. Things were scattered around to make it look like chaos, but nothing of real value was missing. And that red liquid, it didn't dry like real blood. At 9:23 a.m., Brody contacted Melissa, who had just woken up at Jenny Lewis's house. The news of the attack on Ryan was met with hysteria, which Jenny later described as convincing, but somehow controlled. Melissa immediately rushed to the hospital, where she played the role of a grief-stricken bride. She cried in the hallway, begging doctors to save the love of her life and offering money for the best specialists. "She was terrified," recalls Nurse Carol Jenkins, "but not because of Ryan's condition, as we thought at the time. She was terrified that he was still alive." At 3:40 p.m., while Ryan was still in surgery, Detective Brody received important information from Scott Mallory. He told her about Ryan's suspicions about Melissa's past, the fake ID he had found, and his plans to break up with her. "It turned the whole investigation upside down," Brody said. Suddenly, a random robbery turned into a very personal attempted murder. By evening, the police found a gun hidden in the garden and traces of cleaning products on the carpet. An analysis of Melissa's phone showed her movements the day before, including a trip to Tacoma. A comparison of fingerprints with the fake ID confirmed that Melissa Hayes and Amanda Reese were the same person. At 7:22 p.m., when Dr. Hansen reported that the operation had been successful and Ryan was stable, albeit in a coma, Detective Brody arrested Melissa right in the hospital hallway. "Ryan Pierce is alive," Brody said, handcuffing her. "And he will testify against you." According to eyewitnesses, Melissa's face at that moment expressed not fear or remorse, but pure, unadulterated rage. Melissa Hayes had been methodically preparing to eliminate Ryan when she realized he had uncovered her true identity. On Monday, April 17th, while he was making appointments with his lawyer and banker, Melissa carried out her plan. "She acted like a professional killer," said Detective Brody. "She purchased everything she needed to commit the crime and cover her tracks at various stores located far from Milltown." In Tacoma, Melissa bought hunting gloves, red paintball capsules, and a used Glock 19. At a hardware store, she purchased cleaning supplies, rubber gloves, and a large plastic tarp. That evening, she staged the perfect scene of domestic bliss. She cooked Ryan's favorite meal, opened an expensive bottle of wine, and put on a new dress. At dinner, she was unusually affectionate, constantly telling him how much she loved him. "She lulled him into a false sense of security," explains Dr. Harris, a psychologist. "And then she literally put him to sleep by adding a sleeping pill to his wine." When Ryan fell asleep on the sofa, Melissa began staging a robbery. She scattered things around the office and piled valuable items by the door to create the illusion of a burglary in progress. Then she put on gloves, took out a gun, and shot him in the head in cold blood. "I didn't realize right away that it was a gunshot," recalls neighbor Terry Landers. "I thought someone's car had stalled, but then I felt uneasy." The bullet passed through Ryan's frontal lobe and lodged in his skull. Convinced he was dead, Melissa continued to stage the robbery. She broke down the back door, splattered red paint to simulate a struggle, and hid the gun in the garden. At 11:42 p.m., she called her friend Jenny Lewis, saying she had had a fight with Ryan and wanted to spend the night at her place, creating an alibi for herself. She left the house at 11:51 p.m., leaving Ryan to bleed to death. In the morning, a concerned Terry noticed the broken door and called the police. Officer Jim Becker found Ryan alive but in critical condition. "We didn't think he would survive until the ambulance arrived," the officer recalls. "But this guy turned out to be incredibly resilient." Dr. Hansen performed an 8-hour operation, literally pulling Ryan back from the brink of death. "The bullet passed through in such a way that it barely grazed the critical areas of the brain," the neurosurgeon explains. 1 millimeter to the side, and we would have lost him." Detective Brody noticed something strange about the robbery scene from the very beginning. The mess was too neat. Nothing of real value was missing, and the red liquid didn't dry like real blood. When Scott Mallory told her about Ryan's suspicions about Melissa's past and his plans to break up with her, the investigation took a sharp turn. They quickly found the gun in the garden, traces of cleaning products, and analyzed Melissa's movements on the day before the crime. Melissa, meanwhile, was playing the role of a grief-stricken bride in the hospital. "She was terrified," recalls nurse Carol Jenkins, "but not because of Ryan's condition, as we thought at the time. She was terrified that he was still alive." When Dr. Hansen reported that the operation had been successful, Detective Brody arrested Melissa right there in the hospital corridor, saying, "Ryan Pierce is alive, and he will testify against you." The following weeks of investigation revealed a shocking truth. Melissa Hayes was just one of many personas of Amanda Jean Wilson, who was linked to the deaths of at least 2 wealthy men, Gerald Foster and Richard Coalfield. A list of potential targets was found in her notebook, where Ryan was marked as promising, easily manipulated. Ryan began the long road to recovery. For the first few weeks, he hovered between life and death. Gradually, he regained consciousness, then speech, but a serious problem emerged: amnesia. He remembered his childhood and recognized his mother and Scott, but the events of the last 2 years, including everything related to Melissa, seemed to have been erased from his memory. "It was both a blessing and a curse," Scott says. "He didn't suffer from the knowledge of the betrayal, but he couldn't help the investigation either." Gradually, with intensive rehabilitation, Ryan began to recover physically and psychologically. Fragments of memory returned, first isolated episodes of his relationship with Melissa, then the discovery of the fake ID, the meeting with Scott. The turning point came in August, when Ryan suddenly remembered the shot itself. "I remember a flash, a loud bang, the feeling of my head being torn apart from the inside, and before that, her eyes completely empty, like a shark's." This memory, officially recorded and confirmed under oath, became decisive evidence in the case. Amanda Reese was charged with first-degree attempted murder with aggravating circumstances. The trial began in September, and Ryan, despite his physical limitations, insisted on being present in person. I had to look her in the eyes, not as a victim, but as a person who survived. Chapter 5. Witness Testimony. Summary. After the attack, Ryan Pierce began a long road to recovery, both physical and psychological. Melissa Hayes, whose real name turned out to be Amanda Reese, was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The investigation revealed her involvement in the suspicious deaths of at least 2 wealthy men in the past. Gradually, Ryan's memory of the shooting and the events leading up to it returned, which became key evidence in the case. The trial began, and despite his physical limitations, Ryan decided to confront his would-be killer in person. The story Cold November Rain drummed on the windows of the county courthouse on the day Ryan Pierce was scheduled to give key testimony against Amanda Reese. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local residents, and lawyers studying this high-profile case. In the front row sat Sylvia Pierce and Scott Mallory, their faces reflecting tension and anxiety. Ryan entered the courtroom leaning on a cane, thin, with a noticeable scar on his left temple, but with a straight back and a determined look in his eyes. As he passed the defense table, Amanda Reese looked up. For the first time during the entire trial, their eyes met. It was an electric moment, recalls journalist Sarah Chen. He looked at her without hatred, almost with regret. She quickly looked away as if she couldn't bear the silent accusation. After being sworn in, Ryan began methodically describing his relationship with the woman he knew as Melissa. His speech was slower than usual, a result of trauma, but every word was clear and meaningful. She was a master manipulator, Ryan testified. She gradually isolated me from my friends and family. She passed off her control as caring. I was like a frog in slowly heating water. I didn't notice the danger until it was too late. He described how he discovered her fake ID, how he hired a private investigator, how the mosaic of her real past gradually came together. The hardest part was realizing that 2 years of my life had been built on a lie, Ryan continued. Every I love you, every promise, every plan for the future, it was all part of a calculated plan. The climax of his testimony came with his description of the fateful evening. Ryan recalled every detail, the dinner Melissa had prepared, the unusually sweet wine, the sudden drowsiness, and finally, the moment of the gunshot. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was her face, Ryan said, pointing to the defendant. There was no hesitation, no regret, only satisfaction. During cross-examination, defense attorney Richard Kowalski attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of Ryan's memories, citing his brain injury. Mr. Pierce, could your memories have been formed later under the influence of other people's stories or newspaper articles? Kowalski asked. What I remember about the shooting has never been published in the press, Ryan replied calmly. I couldn't recreate the smallest details of her expression or the angle at which she held the gun. These images haunt me every night in my nightmares. After Ryan's testimony, the prosecution presented the results of Dr. James Hansen's thorough investigation, which confirmed that the bullet's trajectory was consistent with a shot fired from close range, from above, while the victim was lying on the couch, rather than the robbery scenario Amanda had initially attempted to stage. The angle of entry of the bullet, the absence of gunpowder burns at a certain distance, the nature of the injuries, everything indicates that the shot was fired deliberately, at close range, while the victim was in a helpless state, Dr. Hansen concluded. The next key witness was Michael Cunningham, a private investigator hired by Ryan. He presented the court with documents confirming Amanda's connection to the suspicious deaths of Gerald Foster and Richard Caulfield. The pattern of behavior is strikingly consistent, Cunningham explained. In all cases, she chose financially secure, emotionally vulnerable men. She quickly gained their trust, isolated them from their loved ones, and gained access to their finances. And when there was a threat of exposure or she achieved her goal, the victims disappeared. Detective Brody then presented the court with a notebook found in Amanda's hiding place, containing a detailed list of potential victims and notes about their financial status, habits, and weaknesses. Ryan's name was underlined in red with the word priority written next to it. This document demonstrates not impulsive action, but cold-blooded planning, Brody emphasized. Every step was calculated long before the crime itself. By the end of the week, the prosecution had presented a complete picture of the crime. From the first meeting at Joe's restaurant, carefully planned by Amanda after studying Ryan's daily schedule, to the preparations for the murder, including the purchase of a weapon and an attempt to create an alibi, the jury listened with bated breath. Unable to refute the key pieces of evidence, the defense focused on Amanda's psychological state, portraying her as a victim of a difficult childhood and abusive relationships that shaped her pathological distrust of the world and her need for financial security at any cost. "We don't deny the facts," Kowalski said in his closing statement, "but we ask you to consider the circumstances that shaped my client's personality. She acted out of deep fear and trauma, not malicious intent." Prosecutor David Church was unyielding in his closing statement. "You are not looking at a victim of circumstance, but a calculating predator. A person who spent years honing her skills of manipulation and deception. She did not just shoot a sleeping man who trusted her, but left him to bleed to death while she calmly secured her alibi." After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Judge Margaret Holloway sentenced Amanda Reese to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years for fraud and forgery. When the judge asked if the defendant had anything to say before sentencing, Amanda showed emotion for the first time during the entire trial. She turned to Ryan and said quietly but clearly, "I should have used poison, like last time." These words, recorded in the court transcript, later became key evidence in the reopened investigations into the deaths of Foster and Coalfield in California and Arizona. After the trial ended, Ryan began a new chapter in his life. His physical rehabilitation progressed slowly but steadily. By the spring of 2025, he was able to walk short distances without a cane, although he tired more quickly than before his injury. His cognitive functions had almost completely recovered, although he still had difficulty concentrating and finding the right words at times. "I'll never be the same Ryan," he admitted in an interview with a local newspaper. But maybe that's for the best, that Ryan was too trusting, too blind to manipulation. The psychological consequences of the betrayal proved to be deeper than the physical injuries. Ryan began working with a therapist specializing in post-traumatic stress and trust issues. "The hardest part is learning to trust people again," Ryan shared. "Every time someone shows interest or kindness, my first thought is, what do they really want? It's exhausting." However, there were rays of light in this dark story. Ryan and Scott's friendship, which had been through trials and tribulations, became stronger than ever. "He literally saved my life," Ryan said of Scott. Not only when he insisted on investigating Melissa's past, but also afterwards, when he sat by my hospital bed, helped with my rehabilitation, and took over the company. You don't forget something like that. Pierce Construction not only survived, but expanded under the temporary leadership of Scott and Don Higgins. They saved jobs and even created new ones, turning the company into a symbol of Milton's revival. The townspeople, shocked by what had happened, rallied around Ryan and his family. Fundraisers were organized to pay for his treatment, and the local church set up a support group for people who had experienced domestic violence. "What happened to Ryan opened a lot of eyes," says Pastor Thomas Green. "People have become more attentive to each other, learned to recognize the signs of toxic relationships, and are not afraid to speak up about their suspicions. Perhaps this tragedy has saved someone else." In June 2025, just over a year after the attack, Ryan established a nonprofit foundation called Second Chance to help victims of financial and emotional abuse. The organization provided legal advice, psychological support, and temporary housing for those trying to escape toxic relationships. "What happened to me was an extreme case," Ryan explained at the fund's launch. "But thousands of people suffer every day from less visible forms of manipulation and abuse. They deserve support and understanding, not condemnation." Ryan and Amanda's story caught the attention of Washington state lawmakers. The Pierce Act was proposed, which toughens penalties for financial fraud committed using personal relationships and simplifies the process of checking a person's background if they are suspected of using a false identity. "We can't stop people from falling in love," commented State Senator Michael Jensen, the bill's sponsor. "But we can give potential victims the tools to protect themselves and ensure appropriate punishment for those who abuse that trust." In August 2025, Ryan gave his first public lecture at Miltaone High School on recognizing manipulation and toxic relationships. His candid story made a deep impression on the teenagers. "Before Mr. Pierce told his story, I thought that kind of thing only happened in movies," said student Emily Johnson. "Now I know what are red flags to look out for." In the fall of that year, on the anniversary of the trial, the documentary Gold Digger was shown on national television. Ryan agreed to be interviewed to warn others. "People tend to think it won't happen to them," he said to the camera, his voice calm and measured. "That they would notice the signs, that they were smarter, more cautious. I thought so too. But manipulators don't choose stupid victims. They choose kind, trusting people who are ready to see the best in others. And it is precisely these qualities that they use against you." The film also featured experts in the psychology of manipulation, who explained the mechanisms Amanda used: rapid formation of emotional dependence, isolation of the victim, gradual blurring of boundaries, gaslighting, and intermittent reinforcement. That is, alternating periods of punishment with periods of emotional generosity. "No one is immune to such manipulation," emphasized Dr. Linda Harris. Ryan's story is an extreme example, but the same techniques are used in less deadly but no less destructive forms of emotional abuse every day. In the final scene of the documentary, Ryan stands on a hill overlooking the Miltaone skyline. His face is calm, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Sometimes people ask me if I regret meeting her," he says. "Honestly? No. Not because I'm a masochist or found some kind of enlightenment through suffering. It's just that now I know what people are capable of, both good and bad. I saw the abyss in the eyes of a person who tried to kill me, but I've also seen the boundless devotion of a friend who never gave up. I turned the bullet that was supposed to take my life into a reminder of how important it is to live consciously. And if my story helps even one person avoid a similar fate or find the strength to get out of a toxic relationship, then it wasn't all for nothing." While Ryan was rebuilding his life, Amanda Reese began serving her sentence in a maximum security women's prison. She refused further interviews and appeals, remaining silent even in the face of new charges in California and Arizona. Her last words in court were her only, albeit implicit, admission of guilt. Miltaone gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The story of the gold digger and the surviving groom became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale that parents told their children, a warning to anyone who was too trusting or too confident in their invulnerability. And Ryan Pierce continued on his path to healing, step by step, day by day, turning his personal tragedy into an opportunity to help others and reminding the world that even the darkest experiences can serve as a beacon for those who risk getting lost in similar storms.